The cold wind blew through the halls of Winchester Castle, carrying with it the whispers of betrayal and the scent of impending doom. On a March day in 1330, the air was thick with tension. King Edward III, a young man with a determined gaze, stood in the grand hall, surrounded by the most powerful lords of the realm. But today, the focus was not on him. It was on his uncle, the Earl of Kent. Mortimer, the regent and de facto ruler of England, stepped forward, his eyes cold and calculating. The hall fell silent as he began to speak, his voice cutting through the air like a sword. "Sir Edmund, Earl of Kent," Mortimer declared, "you are accused of treason against the crown. You have conspired to free the deposed King Edward II and restore him to the throne, thereby threatening the life and reign of King Edward III." Kent's face paled, but he stood tall, his eyes meeting those of his nephew, King Edward. The young king, though only in his late teens, had already seen more than his fair share of betrayal and intrigue. He knew the gravity of the situation, but he also knew that every word and action today could mean the difference between life and death for his uncle. "Is this true, my lord?" Mortimer pressed, holding up a letter sealed with Kent's own seal. Kent hesitated, his voice trembling. "I did not mean to harm my nephew, the king. I only sought to right a wrong. My brother, the former king, was unjustly deposed and imprisoned. I believed that restoring him was the right thing to do." Mortimer's lips curled into a cruel smile. "Your intentions may have been noble, but your actions are treasonous. You have conspired with others to overthrow the rightful king. The evidence is clear." He began to read the letter aloud, his voice growing louder with each word. "Worshipful and dear brother, I pray heartily that you are of good comfort, for I shall ordain for you that you shall soon come out of prison, and be delivered of that disease in which you find yourself. Your lordship should know that I have the assent of almost all the great lords of England, with all their apparel, that is to say with armor, and with treasure without limit, in order to maintain and help you in your quarrel, so you shall be king again as you were before." The words hung in the air, heavy with accusation. Kent's eyes darted around the hall, searching for a glimmer of hope, a sign of mercy. But the faces of the lords were stone, their expressions stern. Edward, standing beside his uncle, felt a pang of guilt and sorrow. He loved his uncle, but he also knew that Mortimer's power was a threat to his own reign. If he showed any weakness now, it could be the end of everything he had fought for. The silence in the hall was deafening. Mortimer, sensing Edward's hesitation, pressed on. "The court has decided. Earl of Kent, you are found guilty of treason. The sentence is death. You will lose both life and limb, and your heirs shall be disinherited forevermore, save the grace of our lord the king." Kent fell to his knees, his voice breaking with desperation. "Please, nephew, have mercy on me. I did not mean to harm you. I only wanted to restore my brother. I will do anything to make it right. I will walk through the streets of Winchester barefoot, with a rope around my neck, if that is what you desire. Please spare my life." The plea echoed through the hall, but Edward remained silent. He looked at Mortimer, who was watching him intently, waiting for his response. Edward knew he had a choice to make. He could show mercy and risk losing everything, or he could stand firm and send a clear message to all who dared challenge his authority. With a heavy heart, Edward spoke, his voice steady but filled with sorrow. "The sentence stands. The Earl of Kent will be executed." The words were a death knell, and the hall erupted in a mix of gasps and whispers. Kent, realizing his fate, burst into tears, his sobs echoing through the chamber. But Edward's decision was final. He had to show that he was the true king, that he would not be controlled by anyone, not even by his own blood. As Kent was dragged away, the weight of his decision settled on Edward's shoulders. He knew that this was only the beginning. Mortimer's power was still formidable, and the threat of rebellion loomed large, but Edward was determined. He would not let his uncle's death be in vain. He would find a way to reclaim his throne, and bring an end to Mortimer's tyranny. The day was dark, but the fire in Edward's heart burned brighter than ever. He knew what he had to do. The path ahead was dangerous, but he was ready to face it, no matter the cost. The night of October 19th, 1330, was tense and full of whispers at Nottingham Castle. The air was thick with the tension of unresolved conflicts and simmering hatred. Roger Mortimer, a powerful and ambitious man, had just arrived to find out that his enemy, Thomas of Lancaster, had been given rooms inside the castle. Mortimer was furious and ordered Lancaster to be moved to a merchant's house in town. He also took control of the castle's garrison and the keys, handing them to Queen Isabella, his ally. King Edward III, who was only 18 at the time, was caught in a web of political intrigue. His friends were urging him to take action against Mortimer, who they believed had murdered Edward's father, King Edward II. But the young king was hesitant, knowing that such a move could be risky. He discovered that his secret information was being leaked to Mortimer by a man named John Wyard, which made him even more cautious. Then, something unexpected happened. William Eland, a man who knew the castle well, revealed a secret passage that led from the riverbank up to the Queen's apartments. Eland told this to Edward first, and then the king sent Eland to his trusted friend, William Montagu, with instructions to use this passage for a surprise attack on Mortimer. On that fateful night, the castle was quiet, and the moon was hidden behind dark clouds. Eland, on Edward's orders, left the lower entrance of the secret passage unlocked. Montagu and his men, including Robert Wyville and Pancio de Controne, a physician, used this passage to sneak into the castle. They climbed the stairs silently, and as they approached the Queen's hall, they heard the voices of Mortimer, Isabella, and their close allies discussing their next move. Suddenly, Sir Hugh Turpington, who was checking the guards, spotted the armed men. He shouted a warning, but it was too late. The hall erupted into chaos. Mortimer's followers, caught off guard, tried to defend the entrance, but they were outnumbered. Mortimer himself fled to the Queen's chamber to grab his sword, but it was no use. Montagu and his men quickly overpowered him and his allies, including his sons Geoffrey and Edmund, and Simon Bereford. Isabella, the king's mother, was frantic. She screamed, not knowing what to do. The prisoners were taken through the secret passage to the riverbank and then to Leicester, where Edward, fearing Mortimer might escape again, ordered him to be hanged. However, the Earl of Lancaster, who had reconciled with Edward, advised him to have Mortimer tried by Parliament for a more legitimate execution. Mortimer was taken to the Tower of London, where he was kept in a small, dark room next to Edward's. On November 26, 1330, Mortimer was dragged before Parliament, bound and gagged. Edward accused him of 14 crimes, including usurping royal power. Mortimer was sentenced to death and hanged at Tyburn. He was made to wear the same black tunic he had worn at Edward II's funeral, a final humiliation. With Mortimer gone, Edward faced the challenge of dealing with the old regime. He had to decide what to do with the lands and wealth that Mortimer and Isabella had accumulated. He also needed to address the grievances of those who had been wronged by Mortimer's rule. Edward acted cautiously, confiscating Mortimer's lands and taking control of Isabella's treasure. He placed Isabella under house arrest, but later granted her a substantial income. The real challenge was dealing with Mortimer's closest allies, especially those who knew the truth about Edward II's fate. Edward cleverly maintained the official story that his father was dead and had been murdered on Mortimer's orders. This allowed him to restore the son of the Earl of Kent and to pardon his uncle, while also taking action against those implicated in the supposed murder. Lord Berkeley, who had cared for Edward II, was not punished but was kept under watch. Edward showed a remarkable ability to forgive. He retained many of Mortimer's supporters in his court, recognizing their skills and loyalty. He appointed some to important positions, like Bishop Burghersh, who had been Mortimer's close friend. This approach helped Edward avoid creating new enemies, and ensured that his government remained stable. As Edward III began to assert his authority, he faced many challenges, but he handled them with a mix of caution, intelligence, and forgiveness. His actions that night in Nottingham Castle marked the beginning of his reign as a powerful and respected king. In the world of the 14th century, the documents that survived mostly talk about money, laws, and what the king or the church was up to. Rarely do they tell us about the fun and games that went on at the royal court. However, we know that King Edward III was really happy when he captured his enemy, Roger Mortimer. After Mortimer was gone, Edward started to enjoy his new power a lot. A man named Sir Thomas Grey wrote that Edward had a gay life, with jousts, tournaments, and parties with ladies. Edward loved these tournaments and games. He organized many of them, both for a few nobles and for the people of London. These were big, showy events with lots of people dressed up in costumes. For example, for the games at Guildford in January 1331, Edward ordered materials to make fake deer and men for mock hunts. He also had banners and masks made for the knights and their helpers. These events were like a big show, with people dressed as merchants, friars, devils, dragons, angels, and even women. Edward kept organizing these events for years, always coming up with new and exciting costumes. These games weren't just for fun. They were a way for Edward to show his power and reinforce the idea of the king as a strong leader. He wanted his court to be a place of wealth and extravagance. For the knights, it was a chance to show their bravery and skill in jousting. Edward was trying to create a world that felt like something out of a legend, where the king and his knights were like the heroes of old stories. He even visited Glastonbury, where King Arthur was said to be buried, to show his connection to the legendary king. Edward's vision of kingship was deeply tied to the stories of King Arthur. He wanted to create a group of knights who were as brave and noble as Arthur's Round Table. The Round Table at Winchester had places for 24 knights plus the king, and Edward formed a similar group with 26 knights. He gave these knights special costumes and armor, often to the men who had helped him capture Mortimer. Edward believed that if he could make the Round Table a reality, his knights could be as great as the legendary ones. But Edward didn't give out a lot of rewards to the men who had helped him take power. He was careful not to make another favorite who might become as powerful as Mortimer. Instead, he wanted his knights to earn their titles and glory through their actions. He was still young, only 19, and he needed to prove himself as a leader. He asked for advice from important people like the Pope and Parliament. He was cautious about going to war or leaving the country, especially since he wasn't sure if his father, Edward II, was still alive. In 1331, Edward wrote to the Pope asking if he should go to Ireland to fix its problems. He also asked if he should go on a crusade. The Pope said that if England was safe, Edward could go to Ireland, but he should delegate the task to someone else. Edward also planned to meet with the Earl of Ulster and the Archbishop of Dublin to discuss his trip. However, he never actually went to Ireland. Some people think he might have been more interested in finding out if his father was in Ireland, especially since there were rumors that Edward II had been taken there after his supposed death. Another time, in April 1331, Edward suddenly left England with a small group of men dressed as pilgrims. They went to France, and it was said that they had gone on a pilgrimage. But some historians think Edward might have been looking for his father, who, according to a letter, had been taken to Normandy. Edward traveled very quickly, which suggests he was in a hurry to find someone. Edward also sent people to look for Thomas Gurney, one of the men accused of killing his father. He chose someone who knew Edward II was probably still alive. Later, Edward got involved in a dispute between his clerk, John Melbourne, and William Fieschi, a relative of the man who wrote the letter about Edward II. Edward made sure John didn't leave the country until he could investigate the matter. All of these actions suggest that Edward might have been trying to find out what happened to his father, even though he did it in secret. Whether or not he found any answers, these events show how much Edward was thinking about his father and how he could use his power to find the truth. After his secret journey to France, Edward threw himself back into promoting his royal image in England. In early May, he and his men took part in a tournament at Dartford, hosted by William Clinton. Edward fought as a knight on Clinton's team, not as the commander. By putting himself at risk, he showed his knights that he was brave and skilled, not just powerful because of his title. During this tournament, Edward's warhorse threw him off, and he was so angry that he switched to a smaller, more modest horse. Some of his knights were surprised, but it turned out to be a lucky move. The temperamental warhorse later threw its rider into a river, and the rider would have drowned if he had been Edward, dressed in heavy armor. A month later, Edward joined another tournament at Stepney, a 4-day event celebrating his son Edward of Woodstock's first birthday. This tournament was organized by Robert Morley, who fought with 15 men dressed in green cloaks with golden arrows. In September, yet another tournament was held in Cheapside, the heart of London, at the invitation of William Montagu. After a special mass for his father and giving money to the poor, Edward and his knights dressed as Tartars and led a procession of the most beautiful women in the realm, all dressed in red velvet and white hoods. Each woman was led by a silver chain held by a knight. Edward led his sister Eleanor, but he also paid attention to the other ladies, including those from the merchant class, which was a new and significant move. However, the tournament started with a disaster when the wooden stand where Queen Philippa was sitting collapsed, injuring many people. Edward was furious and threatened to punish the workmen, but Queen Philippa begged him to show mercy. Edward agreed, but he was determined to continue the tournament despite the near tragedy. Edward's leadership style was a lot like his grandfather, Edward I, known as the Hammer of the Scots. He often visited his grandfather's tomb and treasured a knife used in an assassination attempt on Edward I. Edward felt a strong connection to his grandfather, who was not just a warrior, but also a great lawgiver and leader. In the years since Mortimer's fall, Edward had made progress, but he still needed to prove himself as a leader. Tournaments were fun and showed his bravery, but they didn't demonstrate political skill. For that, Edward needed to show his strength in Parliament. A week after the Cheapside tournament, Parliament met at Westminster. Edward had promised to meet with Parliament annually, and this was his chance to assert his authority. He asked the Lords to stop the practice of maintenance, where they protected their tenants from the law when they committed crimes. This was a bold move, and it showed that Edward was committed to fair rule for all, as he had sworn at his coronation. Parliament also discussed whether England should go to war with France to recover lost lands. Edward wanted to know if he should use force or diplomacy. Parliament advised diplomacy, and Edward agreed, though he might have had other reasons for asking. The diplomatic situation with France was complex, and Edward felt a personal rivalry with King Philip of France, who had recently won a significant victory and was planning a crusade. Edward didn't want to be outdone. Edward's relationship with Scotland was also complicated. He had been forced to recognize Scotland's independence, but he never forgot the insults and the loss of land. When Edward Balliol, the son of a former Scottish king, emerged as a leader of the disinherited Scottish lords who had lost their lands, Edward saw an opportunity. If Balliol succeeded, he would rule Scotland as Edward's ally, and if he failed, the Scots might break the truce and appear as the aggressors. Edward gave Balliol his tacit approval to invade Scotland, and several of Edward's friends joined the effort. While waiting for Balliol's invasion to unfold, Edward and Philippa spent Christmas at Wells, where Philippa was 3 months pregnant. They celebrated with gifts, including a beautifully decorated silver goblet and ewer from Philippa. The goblet featured castles, ships, and beasts, with Edward seated in the middle of a castle, and the ewer was adorned with legendary figures like Julius Caesar and King Arthur. Edward had many other responsibilities to manage. He considered a campaign in Ireland, worried about the University of Cambridge, arrested renegade friars, and arranged marriages for his family. He also received ambassadors from various countries, and sent his own to negotiate on his behalf. In March, he encouraged Parliament to invite Flemish weavers to England, to improve the quality of English cloth. In April, despite Parliament's advice, he sent the Bishop of Winchester to discuss a crusade with Philip of France, and wrote to the Pope about the plan. Throughout 1332, Edward moved around the country, attending feasts, masses, and tournaments. On 16 June, his daughter Isabella was born at Woodstock, and 2 weeks later, he organized a lavish tournament to celebrate Philippa's churching. The decorations were extravagant, and the feast cost more than 10 times the usual daily expenses of the royal household. On 12 July, Edward decided to delay his Irish campaign to see the results of Balliol's adventure. Balliol and his men landed in Scotland on 6 August with a fleet of ships. They faced strong opposition, and the Scottish forces, led by the Earl of Mar, were much larger. On the night of 10 August, Balliol and his military advisor, Henry Beaumont, decided to take the initiative and attack. They crossed the River Erne and surprised the Scottish forces. Despite the initial success, they soon realized they had only engaged half the enemy. Desperate, the English men at arms dismounted and formed a defensive line with pikes and archers on the flanks. They used the pikes to stop the charging horses, and the archers to target the faces of the riders. This bold strategy turned the tide, and Balliol's forces won a significant victory. The Battle of Duplin Moor was a turning point in the history of warfare. On a Scottish moor, English archers, well organized and well trained, stood their ground and turned the tide against the Scottish knights. The archers drove the Scottish flanks into the center, causing chaos and disarray. For centuries, the charge of heavily armored knights had been the deciding factor in battles, but on that day the archers proved their worth. The Scottish front line managed to push the English back a few feet, but then Lord Stafford and another Englishman rallied the troops. The English took heart, and the Scots were dismayed. The battlefield turned into a slaughter, with a pile of dead bodies rising as high as a spear. Back in England, King Edward III was planning an expedition to Ireland. However, when he heard about the victory at Duplin Moor, he realized that the situation in Scotland was more pressing. He ordered Lord Percy to secure the border in case of a Scottish invasion. Edward was surprised by the scale of the victory with only 2 knights, 33 esquires, and no archers or foot soldiers lost. This put Edward in a difficult position, as now Balliol could claim the Scottish throne. Balliol was crowned King of Scots on September 24th, and he wrote to Edward, offering to marry Edward's sister and make her Queen of the Scots. Parliament discussed the situation, and Edward's lawyer, Geoffrey Le Scrope, presented 3 options: support David II, support Balliol, or assert Edward's rights by force. Edward, now 20, was determined to reclaim Scotland. Despite Parliament's caution, Edward took control, appointing a council of 6 wise men to advise him. In March 1333, Edward prepared for a siege at Berwick, a key Scottish town. He ordered the construction of siege engines and the procurement of gunpowder, a recent innovation. The use of gunpowder in warfare was still new, but Edward was eager to try the latest technology. He also summoned Henry Beaumont, who had played a crucial role in the victory at Duplin Moor, to advise him. As the siege began, Edward cut off the town's water supply and bombarded it with boulders and gunfire. The town suffered greatly, with houses and churches destroyed. Edward set up a camp outside the walls, and he and his men waited for the Scots to respond. During the siege, Edward dealt with family matters, including organizing funds for his sister's marriage and granting his young son the title of Earl of Chester. He even took time to visit the Holy Isle of Lindisfarne with his wife, Philippa. The siege dragged on, and Edward turned to games of chess and dice to pass the time. On June 27th, the English launched a coordinated attack by land and sea. The Scots tried to defend the town by setting fire to tar-soaked faggots, but the fire spread out of control, destroying more building. Sir Alexander Seton, the commander of the town, requested a truce, and Edward agreed, demanding 12 hostages, children of prominent men. Seton, who had already lost 2 sons in the war, sent his last remaining son, Thomas, as one of the hostages. The truce was to last 15 days, but the Scots failed to relieve the town. On July 11th, the town and castle surrendered. The victory at Berwick marked a significant step in Edward's campaign to reclaim Scotland. Edward's use of new military technology and his strategic thinking had proven effective, and he was now closer to achieving his goal. But the war was far from over, and the road ahead would be long and challenging.